right, we should now be live. Yep. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another IAF Chats. I'm Green. I'm promoting this one a little bit heavier than I do the other one, so we might get some people who don't know who we are, but I imagine anyone watching this probably knows who we are already. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes. Hello. I am Atoshia. I go by they, them pronouns, and I am strictly very Lakota, so cool time.
Yeah. I also go by they, them pronouns. I am a citizen of the Metis Nations. Yeah. And yeah, so we got Metis, Lakota. Mute that. My Twitch just kicked in. That happens. Yeah. Anyways, we've been doing this for a while. We don't have a proper name. We should probably develop a proper name.
At some point, yeah, that might be useful.
Yeah. Usually it's just us with a loose theme, talking, like shooting the shit, talking about like various political, talking points, topics. Today I thought we might do something a little different. With the heat wave, it's put climate change on everyone's mind. But I don't think a lot of people have actually read a lot of the papers regarding the science behind climate change. Everyone sort of vaguely knows something's wrong. They don't necessarily know what, which is fair enough. But I've read a couple papers over the past decade on the science of climate change and what the projections are and all that. And I thought it might be worth going over them on stream. Now I have 5 papers selected here. We got the CDP carbon major report, which is the very famous stat where 100 companies are responsible for 71% of all climate emissions. That comes from this paper. And we also got a selection of Oxfam papers to go over through when we're done that. Yeah. Have you ever looked at these, Atoya?
I have not.
Okay. Do I have them here with me? Probably not. I ended up printing a bunch of them out, and I don't read on screens very well, so we're gonna have some fun reading on this. But I ended up printing them out at work and reading them. Yeah. So, anything you want to get into before we dive into this, or should we just dive right in?
I think we should just go ahead first into this.
All right. So yeah, we're gonna start with the carbon major report from 2007, CDP. Now I don't know. I don't know CDP's background. I think that they're a nonprofit that is sponsored by like a bunch of major corporations. So this is something we're going to run into, especially when we get into the solutions section. We're going to get very liberal solutions, because even if the science is solid, these are all of these. Both Oxfam and CDP are sponsored by major capitalist corporations who don't want to. Who want to look like they're doing something without affecting the bottom line. So we're going to get some very liberal solutions. It's been a while since I read the carbon major report. Probably I read it like 2018, 2019. So it's been a couple years. But if memory serves me correctly, the solutions it gives are like carbon capping and like very liberal pro-capitalist solutions. Mm-hmm. But if you get around the fact that solutions are very milquetoast, the actual science is very alarming.
Right.
So, are you able to see pretty good on this? Can you see the paper itself?
Yeah, I can.
Okay. So we'll go through this. So yeah, so this is just about the report. I'm not going to read everything verbatim, but the carbon major database stores greenhouse gas emissions data on the largest companies related to the sources of all time. The CDP Carbon Major Report 2017 is the first in an ongoing series of publications aiming at using this database, the most comprehensive available, to highlight the role that corporations can play in driving global energy transition. So once again, we're getting to that. This is where this is where you get into the sort of the capitalist hedging, because the people who have the most to lose from a proper climate response are the only ones with the resources to really conduct these major global reports. Like any NPO that deals with this stuff is in bed with corporations because they got no choice.
Right.
Now, once again, that doesn't mean the science is bad, but I do think it's worth keeping in mind when we get into the proposed solutions. So yeah, large-scale greenhouse gas emissions data has traditionally been collected at a country level. In fact, these emissions can be traced back to smaller groups of commercial decision makers. The Carbon Majors database was established in 2013 by Richard Heed. I'm going to go with Heed. To the Climate Accountability Institute to show how the emissions are linked to the companies or carbon majors. Now the CDP works in collaboration with the CAI to maintain the database and share its important data and insights with stakeholders. I find like uses like this language, like if you know who's a stakeholder in climate change? Everybody.
Right.
So like this is clearly like when this is stakeholders, they mean capitalist stakeholders. They mean like corporations and corporate leaders. But like really, the fate of the climate is all of us.
Right.
So I find this once again like this hedging is always like deeply concerning to me. But once again, having read the paper, the science itself is not hedged like these intros and outros are. Do we need to go over the rest of this? I think this is just the background of the study and the company. So in 2015, a fifth of global industrial greenhouse gas emissions was backed by the public listed investments. This gets into one thing that like people will cite when they talk about the 100 corporations, and I'll like preview this is they don't just mean private corporations. There are public institutions, government-owned agencies, and public publicized corporations as well. A lot from Russia and China, especially. So this isn't just this is one thing that like I think a lot of leftists sort of fall into when the study uses corporations, they do absolutely implicate privately owned corporations. This isn't like an anti public works or public energy projects thing, but it's not just private corporations. They do also put this on state-owned corporations. I do also want to preface, they do not mention the U.S. military at all. In fact, I can't find any solid papers on the U.S. military, but I think it's generally largely uncontroversial that the U.S. military is the largest polluter in the world, hands down.
Right, yeah.
It also does not, if memory serves me correctly, it also does not talk on the agricultural industry. This is only gas industry. And agriculture is also a massive polluter. So when this paper talks about the 71%, really it's just talking about 71% of total gas emissions, not so that's not 71% of total emissions everywhere. It is total emissions of one of the most polluting industries, but not total global carbon emissions.
Right.
And I think that's the one thing that people who this is why I want to go over this paper, because I think it gets misquoted a lot. Many oil and gas majors are already developing scenarios to comprehend the potential role of the future energy system. The Carbon Majors database is also projected out to 2100 to illustrate the contracts and conveniences theory at the company level, setting science-based targets as an initial step to companies to take navigating themselves through this global transition. Suffice to say, I'm skeptical of this sort of thing. Like, I don't think. I mean, we may hit a point where climate gets so bad that capitalist institutions have no choice but to begin this transition. But they're going to be behind the bar because any capitalist institution is going to put their profits before climate action, because they know full well that their competition, no climate company is going to voluntarily put themselves behind their competition when it comes to taking climate measures, right? So if climate measures costs bottom line, unless every corporation takes those measures at the same time, you are instantly putting yourself at a disadvantage in the marketplace. So I am very skeptical of any capitalist institution taking real measured change based on science, just because it's not to their, because ultimately capitalism, marketplace matters more than the earth. So this report is aimed at investors wishing to better understand the amount of carbon associated with their fossil fuel holdings. Further, it is intended that this output will improve transparency from the fossil fuel companies, particularly around the product-related Scope 3 emissions, as well as providing them with contextual information regarding their share of global emissions. The database can also be useful to a policy analyst and academics for developing further insights into global research. So yeah, this is one thing I do really like about the study. So I've been kind of shit talking and hedging despite the fact that like we're reading it. Companies and corporations gather information on climate change all the time. What makes this different is they made it public. Because most internal papers on this topic, I have no access to. That's sort of what makes this in the Oxfam papers really interesting, is the fact that like I can just go to their websites, find them, and read them. Whereas like historically, we know that oil industry has actively suppressed this information. And we also know that like tobacco like suppressed information on like the negative health impacts of cigarettes, and like, so this is a really unusual situation where even if I disagree with or not even if I'm skeptical of a lot of the claims about what it does on a corporate level and like how these corporations will respond using this information, the fact that they even made it public is quite a remarkable step. Now, I should also say I'm not an academic. I'm not qualified to speak to criticize the veracity of the study itself. But I mean, I've read papers from academics who it all seems to check out.
Right.
But I work in a hardware store. Like, I'm scientifically literate, but just literate. I can't add anything to scientific conversations. I can comprehend what I read. I know enough science to read stuff and be like, yeah, this looks, but I can't. I can't add anything to the conversation. I don't have the background.
Right.
Like I said, I work in a hardware store. I used to work in a wildlife center. Like, very macro or very very micro, like very specific. Like, I could maybe tell you about how carbon would affect my specific wildlife center. You might be able to hear my sister laughing in the background. I apologize. Nothing to do with that. You know, house sharing is what it is. Companies included in the database are invited to share updated greenhouse gas emissions figures where estimates have been employed. Other stakeholders are also welcome to share the view data. So that's another thing I should state, is that this is from 2017, so it's now 5 years out of date. I did try and find a more up-to-date study. I thought they had released one in 2021, but I guess I was mistaken. I could not find it. All right, so now with all that preface and preamble out of the way, let's get to it. We're going to skip this this preamble from the author. All right. So the Carbon Majors database brings fresh perspective to global greenhouse gas emissions, attributing emissions by attributing them to companies. Yada yada yada. This is more prefacing. Yeah. So let's just skip all this and just go right to these figures right here. So 100 fossil fuel products producers. So this is who they examined. They examined 100 companies or producers. So once again, not necessarily all private companies, just this is how much. So 923 billion tons of CO2 emissions were tracked, with a 52% of global industrial greenhouse gases since the Industrial Revolution. So transparency is the heart of the approach. Yeah. All right. Yeah. So this right here, I don't want to read through. I'm going to drop the link to this in the. I don't want to read through the whole paper like this textbook. But I'm going to drop the link in the chat, just so y'all can go and read it yourself if you're so inclined. If it will, why is it? It's not liking my. Having trouble connecting. Please check to your internet connection. Oh, are we going live? Yeah, we're going live. I don't know why. All right, I'm going to do it this way then. Paste here instead then. There we go. Went right to. Oh, that link didn't work. Either way, I'll figure it all out in the end. But I'll post the whole link after the fact. It doesn't seem to be cooperating. Nope. Oh, there we go. It worked on the second shot. Yeah. Anyway, so these are figure number one: oil and gas companies produce portfolio mix of greenhouse gas emissions intensity. So with the purple being bitumen, the light red being crude. What does NGL stand for? So light red, the pink being gas. I don't know what NGL reference is. Is it in here somewhere? One second. I'm just going to. NGL gas meaning. Okay, natural gas liquids. That's what NGL
Okay. Cool.
Okay. So yeah, so basically tar sands, crude oil, natural gas in liquid form, and natural gas in gas form. These are the production values. So this will tell you what the highest polluters on the list, what they all export. So Husky's number 2, Suncor's number 1. So we'll get more into what they are deeper into the paper. So this is what important. A huge acceleration extraction of fossil fuels has doubled in contribution since 1988. So we can see this graph right here shows us the extraction level since from 1988 to 2015. So you can see right here that like oil and gas specifically has dropped, although it's back up. But there's been a huge increase in coal that has only recently dropped down as we start switching away from. We've just recently started switching away from coal, but greenhouse gas emissions completely have gone up substantially. And this paper also, this graph right here also illustrates this.
Yeah.
This is the rates, the rate 1988, and then up here. So, yeah. So from basically 1850 to contemporary, we have seen quite a staggering rise in extraction of gas, liquid, and coal.
Right.
Coal has sort of tapered off recently, just like, and I mean recently, I mean in the past like 5 years or so. Like with it, without not even within the data of this paper's perspective, like coal is just now tapering off. And a lot has to do with like China moving away from coal. America has also made promises to move away from coal, but they're slow to follow through on them. In 1988, the IPCC established, and as such effects in human activities on climates were officially recognized. Despite this landmark, the fossil fuel industry has expanded prodigiously since 1988 and has become more carbon intensive. So this is probably important because it actually shows you that non-binding agreements like Kyoto. Now Kyoto was much later than 1988. Kyoto was 2000. Wait, the Kyoto Accords. I should know this. Kyoto Accords. I want to say. Oh, 1997. So I'm off by a decade. But yeah, so like this is even prior to the Kyoto Accords. So it really makes me skeptical of like non-binding agreements like Kyoto and Paris. So yeah, the contribution of fossil fuels to global warming has doubled. Was entitled to just 28 years since 1988 compared to what is the GTCO? Oh, global total carbon emissions. That's what that means, squared.
Right.
Okay, so global total carbon emissions in 237 years between. So yeah, so we produced between 1995, 1997, between 2017 and 1988. We produce just as many total carbon global emissions as we had in 237 years prior to it, which is not a shock to anybody. Coal makes up the largest share of fossil fuels. Once again, this is where the paper being a couple of years out of date is a problem. I mean, coal is still a huge factor. Don't get me wrong. Coal is still a major player in the fossil fuel industry. It's just in actual we have started to see actual follow through on cutting coal. So I would be interested to see what the modern an updated version of this. Although we do have more up to date when we get further into it, we do have the Oxfam has more up to date data, so we might actually get and some of those I haven't read. So we might, when we get into the Oxfam stuff, we might get a better look at what coal looks like presently.
Right.
So yeah, so the carbon on right depicts the independent contribution of emissions from oil, gas, and coal. Shows that despite the increase in shares of gas, a less carbon-intensive fuel. The vast expansion of coal production over the past 15 years has led to an overall emission intensity of fossil fuels since 1988 to increase by 2.4%. Large ventures into carbon-intensive unconventional oils have emerged. Companies such as Suncor, ExxonMobil, Chevron, Shell, ConocoPhillips have invested in the extractions of oil sands, tight oil, heavy oils, and other forms which carry a larger environmental impact than the conventional crude oil. So yeah, this is also relevant for Canada because Canada is Canadian oil is mostly oil sands. So the process for refining oil sands basically means you have to take because oil sands on their own are useless. So you have to refine the oil to remove the sand, and this is also a carbon intensive process. But because it removes, because it is more fuel, because like the relations between Canada and US, US being the most oil demanding country in the world. I think when this was written, China was possibly the most, but China's made much better strides towards getting off oil than the US has. I got a lot of criticisms of China, and like I got a lot of criticism of China's environmental portfolio, but they are definitely doing better than the US.
Mm-hmm.
So anyways, this is what the Keystone XL pipeline was all about. Was like shipping this carbon high intensity oil from Canada into the US because it was better for quote unquote fuel sovereignty for the US. But it's a much less environmentally friendly. I mean, all oil is bad for the environment, but like oil sands are much worse for the environment because of the process of filtering out the sand from the oil. It generates a lot of carbon in itself. So fossil fuels are the largest anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions in the world. The fossil fuel industry and its product account for 91% of global total emissions. So fossil fuels are the largest source of anthropogenic greenhouse gases emissions in the world. The fossil fuel industry and its producers accounted for 91% of global industrial greenhouse gases in 2015. Now it's 70% of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, if you go to the link, all the sources are down here. So everything's sourced. If the trend in fossil fuel extraction continues for the next 28 years, as it has over the previous 28 years, the global average temperature will be on course to rise around 4 degrees Celsius, which is that is the worst case scenario. I mean, the worst case scenario is 6 degrees Celsius, which that is a doomsday scenario. So 4 degrees Celsius is the highest possible rate without a total doomsday scenario.
Right.
This would entail substantial species extinctions, large risk to regional and global food securities, and could cross multiple tipping points in the Earth climate systems. So all of this is just talking about greenhouse gases. So this isn't talking about cascade effects. So like this is just 4 degrees Celsius on its own. But this could also tip a cascade effect where like greenhouse gases that are currently frozen in the Arctic could also start unthawing. In fact, well, they already are unthawing. We already know that this is happening, and that could tip this 4 degrees to being 5 or 6.
Yep.
That is a scenario that is outside the scope of this paper, but it bears thinking on. Over half of global industrial emissions since human-induced climate change was officially recognized can be traced to just 25 corporate and state producing entities. So this is the crux of it. This is really what we're looking at this paper for. So we want to know who is responsible for this. Now, number one is Chinese coal. Once again, I don't know where China and Chinese coal would rate now. China has started moving away from coal, quite possibly actually as a result of this paper. So I don't know that they'd still be number one, but I mean they're still a large coal producer. I don't want to say they're not a coal producer. They are, but they are taking genuine steps away from coal production.
Right.
But yeah, so we're looking at like China, National Iranian Oil, Russian coal, CNP, PDVSA, Peabody, Total, Petrobras, Nigerian National Petrol, Saudi Aramco, ExxonMobil. So ExxonMobil is number 5. Saudi Aramco is number 2. So I'm not reading these in proper order. I should be. So let's go through this again in proper order. Oh no! I accidentally hit. My mouse has a button on the side that I sometimes actually hit that takes me back and forth.
Right.
Where were we? We were not. There we go. Okay. So yeah, let's go through this back in proper order. So China coal, Saudi Aramco, which I mean, the Saudis don't get enough credit, don't get enough flack for being a major oil producer, and major warmongers.
Yeah.
But the Saudi royal family is a huge player in this industry, to the point where they are. I would not be surprised with China actually making genuine efforts to address global their coal problem. I would not be surprised if Saudi Arabia is now number 1.
Right.
And once again, none of this is just carbon production of oil. This is not like talking about like U.S. military burning of oil or like cars, so on. Gazprom, National Iranian Oil is number 4. Gazprom, let me do a quick search because Gazprom, I know the name. I don't know where they're from. They're Russian. Okay, they're a Russian private interest. So right now, Russian, Iranian oil, ExxonMobil is American. Coal India is of course India. Russian state-owned coal is number 7. Pernex, I don't know where Pernex is. Pernex is Mexican, state-owned. So Pernex is a Mexican state-owned petroleum company. And Shell, of course, we all know Shell. Shell's one of the ones that is most in the news. They are British. I'm not going to bother looking at the rest of these, but like CNP I know, but I can't place. I think they're American, but I might be wrong on that. BP is obviously British Petroleum. Chevron's American. Poland is very high up on this. Kuwait. So like this is just to go over, like this is just the top 25 polluters. This isn't even the full 100. This is just the top 25.
Right. Yeah.
And we're looking at like a total global like basically every continent covered here. There's Africa and the Middle East, Asia, North America, like everywhere. It's the problem is global. So yeah, here we go into the analysis of the top 25. So we got Chinese coal. I'm not sure it's worth reading this because once again, China has changed their coal industry substantially since this paper was. Let's read it anyways, but just with the mind that China has actually China is the one group who has looked at this paper and took action on it. So I don't know where China's at right now because I haven't seen any data on it. Once again, we might, when we get into the other papers I haven't read, we might get to that.
Right.
During a millennium, the growth of the Chinese coal industry has tripled nearly 4 billion tons, representing high global output. Most of this expansion has occurred in the province of Shanxi, Shanxi, and Inner Mongolia. I thought Mongolia was its own country. Oh, maybe they just have Chinese national oil producers in Mongolia,
Could be.
such as Shenhu, Datong, and Chinese Coal Energy are key players in these regions. Coal production in Chinese is broken down into state-owned industry groups, which may partially own one or a number of listed subsidiaries. According to the Chinese-based data service company SX Coal, the production from the top 55 coal company groups in 2015 to 71% of natural production. Half the Chinese coal production in 2015 came from 15 company groups, and 1/3 of national productions from just 7 companies. So, and then that's the list of companies. I'm not going to bother reading them off, but yeah. So when it talks about the 100 companies, like up here, like 25 of them are China. Once again, like that is there. This is not will not be an accurate representation of what things are now. China has actually made moves to this. Russia, on the other hand, has not. Russia, if anything, Russia has expanded since this would have been released.
Right.
Russia's 6th largest production of producing nation and has seen production increase of 70% since the late 90s. To 373 million tons in 2015. This growth has been driven largely by an expansion in Kemerovo. I'm sorry, I butchered that, I'm sure. Southwest Siberia, in which Kuznets and Kuzbas coal has been located. The coal industry in Russia remains in state hands for most of 1990, during which it underwent restructuring the private investment. So of course, the collapse of the USSR. By the end of 2002, Russian coal industry had been fully broken down and privatized. Siberian Coal Energy Company is one of the outcome of this transitions. SUEK was formed in 2001 through the affiliation of companies in the Irkutsk and Chita regions. I'm sorry, my Russian is... I don't speak Russian to be very apparent to everyone. Of Buryatia. It soon expanded assets rapidly in numerous of other areas, including Kuzbas Basin, 3/4 of Russia coal produced in 2015, shared between 12 companies, and half of the production came from just 4 companies. SUEK, I'm not even going to try to pronounce that. SDS Coal and Ivraz. So those are the 2 national productions. What we got left? Yeah, it's only we got about 2/3 through. Investors in fossil fuel companies carry influence over 1/5 of industrial greenhouse gases emissions. So this is So that 71% is actually 71% of 1/5, which is still a substantial amount, but it doesn't mean that these 100 companies are responsible for 71% of total greenhouse emissions. They are percent. That is a percentage of a percentage.
Mm-hmm.
Because once again, this only deals with the fossil fuel industry. This does not deal with agriculture, military, or other high carbon production industries.
Mm-hmm.
New to the Carbon Majors Database 2015 sample, which comprises direct operations and production of the greenhouse gas compared to periods since 1988, 2015. Emissions from investor-owned companies are significant. So this is the difference between like privatized companies and state-owned companies. Of the 3.6 total greenhouse total carbon 2 emissions of operations and productions in greenhouse gases emissions from 224 fossil fuel extraction companies, 30% is publicly investor owned. So with 11 private investor owned and 59% state owned. So state owned does actually still produce over half of the total global carbon emissions, which is interesting to see once again. But that makes sense when you think about like states like the Saudis. The Saudi royal family owns all of its oil production, and they're like number 2 in this, and I would guess number 1 now, but I don't know for sure. The distribution mission concerned with 50 fossil fuel companies figures account half of the global industry greenhouse gas emissions. All companies sample account for 72% of global emissions. Most of the largest companies are oil and gas companies, including the top 50 fuel companies, 29 oil and gas companies, according to 1/3 of the global industrial greenhouse gases. So, yeah. So this is a list of who the private producers are. So these two up here were the national producers, and this is who the number one. So yeah, Saudi Aramco is number 1 private producer by quite a large margin. So I bet you if you were to look at any of the Russian companies as individual companies, the Saudis would still come way out ahead. Now I'm guessing the Saudis are put here as a privately owned because they're privately owned by the royal family. That's why they're not listed as a state owned. So Gazprom, next, Coal India, and you sort of see it top off. Where is? I'm just trying to find where the Canadian National Oil Program is, but I'm not seeing it here. Anyway, yeah. So this is the state off. So like the Saudis are, once again, they're the number 2. And that's just a picture of a bad CGI picture of some windmills. So yeah, we're getting down to the end now. There's only 4 more pages, and the last 2 I think we're going to skip because they are just lists of stats. Fossil fuel extraction companies will need to. So this is the solutions section. So this is where I want to talk about like where. So all the data up here is entirely accurate. I don't doubt the science at all. And also like this does not. If they were trying to suppress data, they would not put data out that makes them look so bad.
Right. Yeah.
But this is where they get into. So this makes it sound like the fossil fuel extraction companies will need to plan their future in context of radical transformation of global energy systems. This makes it sound a lot more radical than what you actually read if you get into it. Future modeling has undertaken the fossil fuel companies long before climate change era costs and managed reserves. Oil and gas companies are now analyzing scenarios in which global emissions are constrained to avoid dangerous climate changes. In so doing, these companies are better positioned to understand and define their potential roles. So then we get into transition plans. The next step, the company's designed transition plan that will minimize the physical and transitional risk of imposed by climate change. Transition plans begins with setting emission targets. The science, I mean, if the emission targets, setting emission targets has never worked, and I agree it's where we got to start because we got to have a target, but so long as the emission targets are non-binding without consequences, we zoom past them every fucking time. The Science-Based Target Initiative was established in 2015 to guide companies in this area to set corporate standards in alignment with with a 2 degree Celsius limit to rise global averages temperature above the pre-industrial level. So this is actually even higher. So the scientific consensus is actually to try to keep climate targets at a 1.5 degrees Celsius total global. So this is actually a little higher than what even scientists are trying to hit. Although, given the fact that we're on our way to 4 easy, I would not complain about it too.
Right.
The implications of temperature limits to cap global greenhouse gas emissions, which in turn places caps on the extraction of fossil fuels. 2009, Marchens et al. Qualified proven fossil fuel reserves against a global carbon budget for the first time. It showed that existing reserves and fossil fuels contain locked-in emissions far above the carbon budget required for a 2 Celsius limit. The truth confirms the risk of standard assets. When reserves become financially unavailable to extract and must be abandoned. The recent study found over $2 trillion of investments in fossil fuel companies is at risk of being stranded. So this is just like investors, this is sort of about like what happens to investors' money when the carbon crash comes. And this is a depiction, a graph of what the goal is. So according to this, like by 2025, they expect to be this high, but then they expect to start cutting it by 2050, down to basically 1975 areas.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, this is another thing. Like in order to, well, let me finish off before I get into that thought. Figure 8 chart illustrates construction conversion. Greenhouse fossil fuel sectors is just everything I was just talking about. Let's go down. And these are the science-based targets. The primary energy sector. So yeah, this is just work is underway to define the methodology of coal, oil, gas extraction companies can use to scope 1 and scope 3 use production science-based targeting. The fossil fuels industry is a subset of the primary energy sector, which includes production of all primary forms of energy, fossil fuels and biomass, nuclear, hydro, wind, solar, and other renewables. The company's primary energy production portfolio defines in sector and the SDC. The sector is the basis by which the benchmark is setting science-based targets. For example, let's skip the example. Let's actually jump down to the scenario here. The SDC does not specify the use of any one emission scenario. The SDA, not the SDC. The SDA does not specify the use of any one emission scenario. Work is now being carried out to define and envelop with which scenario may be deemed acceptable. Figure 10 is an illustration of the envelope concept. The approach, the data borrowed from IPCC 5th assessment reports and the AR5 scenario database links mission. Blah, blah, blah. So yeah, okay. I thought that there was a thing where they talked about like carbon cap, but I guess maybe I'm misremembering. It's been a couple of years since last time I read this. Because I remember the carbon cap just being like, or maybe that's the carbon majors report, or maybe that's the carbon inequality report where they talk about that. But yeah. Anyways, that's that. Is there anything you want to go over before we jump on to the next paper?
I don't think so.
It's a lot. It's
yeah.
a fucking lot. I'm going to share screen and go over to the next paper. Upper tab. Share. All right. close that. On the next one. All right. So okay. So there's been some comments while I was reading this. Let me go over this. So the CNPC very well might be Chinese, so it just might not be state owned. I do not tolerate. I'm just gonna block this person. I don't tolerate anti-Middle Eastern hate. The problem with the Saudi family is that they are royals, not that they are Middle Eastern.
Right. Yeah.
People in the Middle East are some of the most susceptible to climate change because it's some of the hottest places in the world. And yeah, I will not tolerate any racial or national based hatred on this. Because like Africa and the Middle East are going to be the most, and India are going to be the most hard hit by climate change.
Yep.
All right. So one thing I'm not going to read the IPCC report today, because it's quite frankly it's just too big. It's fucking huge. I would like to. Maybe I'll do a stream on my own time where I read it, because it would be interesting to read, and I have not sat down and read the whole thing. That sounds actually very interesting. But that won't be today. All right, on to the carbon inequality report, which I actually think is the more interesting of the two. This is a breakdown of carbon inequality by class. Excuse me. One moment. I'll take some antacids. So you may have seen this graph before. This is a report that's from. Climate change is inexplicably linked to economic inequality. It is a crisis that drives. Before I start reading it, so this is the Oxfam. This is an Oxfam report from 2015. There is an updated one from 2020 that I have not read. So I've read this one before, but I have not read the updated one from 2020, which we will be looking at as well after this, to see how it's changed. But in the meantime, let me just link this in the. There we go. Hooray! I didn't have any problem linking this one. I think the other one would just have such a long URL that StreamYards was just like, no.
Right. Yeah.
All right. So that's the link down there. So this, like I said, this is from 2015. There is an updated one we'll be looking at as well. Theoretically, they'll also put one out in 2025. I think this is like in every 5 years they put a report. Climate change is inextricably linked to economic inequality. It is crisis that has driven greenhouse gas emissions of the haves that hits the have-nots the hardest. In this briefing, Oxfam demonstrates the extent of global carbon inequality by establishing and comparing the lifestyle consumption emissions of the rich and poor citizens of different countries. Strikingly, our establishment of scale and inequality suggests that the poorest half of the global population, around 3.5 billion people, are responsible for roughly only 10% of total global emissions attributed to individual consumption. Yet live overwhelmingly in countries most vulnerable to climate change. This sort of like gets into like when you hear talk about like personal carbon footprint, it's largely a scam, and this sort of gets into why it's largely a scam. Because carbon footprint is mostly related to consumption, and very few of us consume enough individually to really affect carbon. Even I, being a relatively poor person but living in a first world country, still have a pretty low carbon footprint when compared to like the top 10%.
Mm-hmm.
And this will break all of that down. We'll get into it. Around 50% of these emissions, meanwhile, can be attributed to the richest 10% of people around the world, who have an average carbon footprint 11 times higher than the poorest half of the population, and 60 times higher than the poorest 10%. The average footprint of the richest 1% of people globally could be 175 times that of the poorest 10%. While COP21 in Paris will be, so this will be a COP21. So this is before the Paris Accords were signed. This is when the Paris Accords were, this is right before the Paris Accords happened.
Mm-hmm.
So I think this was specifically made to be presented at the Paris Accords, but I might be mistaken. Well, COP21 in Paris will see a deal of negotiation between governments on the basis of total emission productions in their territories. The real winner and losers will be the citizens. The litmus test will be whether it delivers something for the poorest people, who are both the least responsible for and the most vulnerable to climate change, wherever they live. Oxfam's new data analyst, which attributes estimated lifestyle consumption emissions from different countries to a varying outcome of groups with them. See box 1, definitions of methodology. That's this, I think. Not only show the extreme nature of global carbon inequality, but also helps bust some of the myths that have circulated around the UN's climate talks for years about who is driving climate change. Companies that average lifestyle consumption footprints, the richest and the poorest citizens, range from countries to help show that which some emerging economies like China, India, Brazil, and South Africa have high, rapidly rising emissions. Lifestyle consumption emissions of even the richest citizens remain some way behind their counterparts in the richest OECD countries. So, okay. So this is interesting, and I don't think I grokked this the first time I read this paper. So even the rich in developing countries such as China, India, Brazil, and South America consume less than the rich in first world countries. That is an interesting little detail, an interesting little note. Even though this is changing and will continue to do so without current climate. This is also like almost 10 years out of date now. This is from 2015. So Chinese and these consumption may have changed in the past 7 years.
Right.
But once again, we will be getting to an updated version of this paper, but I still think it's worth reading this one before we get to the updated one. The lifestyle emissions of the hundreds of millions of poor citizens, meanwhile, remain significantly lower in even the poorest people in the OECD. So OECD. While the richest citizens can and should contribute to individuals to cutting their own emissions through lifestyle changes, whether they cannot solve the climate crisis through voluntary action alone. So this is what I was talking about earlier. Like, while it's still good for myself, being living in a first world country, to cut my carbon emissions, no amount of carbon emissions I do, no amount of carbon cutting I do will solve climate change. And no amount of and even if every person like me cut our emissions to near zero, it would not solve the problem.
Right.
Their choices are often contained by decisions of their governments in all sorts of areas, from energy and transport policy without questions. A weak agreement in Paris is no more than their interest than it is in interest of the poorest and least responsible. Increasingly, members of the richest 10% are experiencing the impact of climate change themselves and are mobilized to demand action from their governments. Yeah, I guess. I think it's a lot of fluff. Like, this is before Tesla became. This is like right before Tesla became hot shit.
Right.
So I
Yeah.
think Tesla really is a good litmus test of like what sort of actions they're demanding really looks like. Because Tesla is a really superficial way of like dealing with climate change, right? Like, it's electric cars for the rich and famous, and the rich and famous only. It doesn't do anything about solving transport issues, car dependency, the urban planning problems of like single use homes, which consume a lot more than single family homes, which consume a lot more than like what we in North America call missing middle homes, like, and that's without even getting into like capital itself.
Right. Yeah.
So like, well, I get what they're saying here, and I may even have been more when if I read this in 2015, I would have been more confident in it as a statement than I am now, because it's very clear that like what the rich actually want is a very superficial mobilization. Because quite frankly, they think they can go to Mars.
Yeah.
The only beneficial inequality for climate action, Paris and beyond, are the much smaller elite and the vested interest in the continuation of a high carbon, deeply unequal global economy. Between Copenhagen and Paris climate conferences, the number of billionaires on the Forbes list with interest in fossil fuel activity has risen from 74 to 88. So this once again goes back to like what kind of action are they actually demanding? Because they're demanding action, but then they're investing in carbon heavy industries more and more. So like, what's their action actually? Are they actually going to take action that's going to hit their bottom line and actually do some good? Well, no, of course not, right? Because that's just not how capitalism is designed. Well, aside the companies, while the size of their combined personal fortunes has expanded by around 50%, over 200 billion to more than 300 billion, the governments in Paris need to stand up to their influences and stand up for their citizens, the poorest and lowest emitting and most vulnerable among them, first and foremost. Paris is to be believed the agreement for those who need it most. So yeah, so that's the mission statement. It basically comes down to, like I said, this is looking at like carbon emissions through a class lens. And here's the important stat. Here is the visualization of carbon emissions. You're right there?
Yeah, sorry, I'm just trying to get some popcorn for me.
No worries. Yeah, anyways, here's the visualization of total global emissions by class. This is so important, and this is like something people need to fucking understand. I think this is the most important. This is why I wanted to read this paper specifically instead of going right to the more updated one, because this visualization is just so important for people to understand. Like, I mean, if you were looking at like me, like a relatively poor person in a first world country in Canada, developed nation. I think developed nation is the proper current terminology. In a developed nation, I'm probably somewhere in this 11% right here, maybe in the 7. But like, nothing compares to this top 10% right here. 49%, basically 50% is contributed by just 10% of the global population. Like, you just cannot escape this. Just once you see this, you just really understand that climate change is not being driven by the small people. There's no cutting our carbon on an individual level that will solve this problem.
Right.
It is, and it's also not population, right? So we have 10% that contribute 50% of the total global population. So like this really throws the Malthusian argument into doubt, because like the Malthusian carrying capacity of the world, well, clearly, like if 10% is responsible for half the problem, clearly it's a matter of consumption, not of population. So like that really that just throws the Malthusian argument out the window.
Right.
And like when you get into the really poor, the truly desperate in like what I guess we'd call developing nations, although like that's I don't think developing nations is any less condescending than third world nation. Like both sound really condescending. We need better language for that. But I think is a different conversation. But like so if we put like so the poor is 50%. If we add up their carbon, so we got 3, 2, 4, 1, so 0.5 is 1%. So it's 2, 3, 5. That's another 2, 7. So 10. So the poorest 50% of the world population is responsible for total combined 10% of total global emissions.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, I didn't even need to do that. It was done for me right here. I'm just like you just can't get away from that. There's nothing. Like it throws everything the popular consensus about climate change says out the window.
Right.
And once again, that doesn't mean like it even says up here, like that doesn't mean that like people like me shouldn't try to reduce our carbon footprint. We should, but it's just that's not the solution to the problem.
Right. Like we do have individual responsibilities to like, you know, at least make sure that we're not getting fucked over in the future, but also a lot of that falls in like, you know, the like fucking elite class and shit. Like it's just
Oh yeah, well like I said, 50%. 50%.
Yeah.
They do 50% on their own.
Mm-hmm.
Like I am at most 11% of the problem. And like 11% is not an insignificant number. It's just
Right.
pales in comparison to 50.
Yeah.
We can and also they conservatively estimate. So this is the most conservative of all their math. The average emissions of the person in the poorest half of the global populations are 1.5 total carbon emissions squared. Equals 11 times less than the average footprint of someone in the richest 10%.
Right.
The average emissions of someone in the poorest 10% of the global populations is 60 times less than someone in the richest 10%.
Mm-hmm.
While estimates are at the extreme top and bottom of the global economic distributions are more difficult to make, then there is no question the gap is much wider. The richest 1% may emit 30 times more than the poorest 50%.
Mm-hmm.
And 175 times more than the poorest 10%. So that's the top the top 1% right here, top 10% right here, and then this is the poorest, and then this would be like where I'm at, where you and I are at, like.
Mm-hmm.
So like it's just you once again like this disrupts so many narratives. This disrupts so many narratives about like how we deal with climate change.
Right.
And this doesn't even get into like how like we don't how like most recycling doesn't get into recycling, and how like recycling actually generates carbon and a lot of other things. But like it's just yeah, the how we view the solution to climate change, just the popular narratives won't work, because people like you and I don't produce enough carbon emissions to cut them enough to solve the problem.
Mhm.
I don't even think it's a systemic. I wouldn't even say the rich need to cut their emissions per se. We just need to not have rich people anymore.
Yeah.
Like this goes in. This is the crux of how I became an anti-capitalist. Which is that no one should be able to have this. Like no one should be able to even have this to be able to produce this much. Like there's no realistic world should 10% of the population even be able to pollute as much as everyone else in the world.
Right. Like there's this account on Twitter that tracks whenever rich people or people in the US, I guess, use private jets to travel to short distances.
Drake traveled just today or maybe yesterday, traveled from Toronto to Hamilton by jet. I have biked to Hamilton from Toronto. They are not far.
Right.
It was
Yeah.
a 14-minute trip. Oh, I gotta plug my computer in. It's about to die.
Yeah, recently one of the Kardashians used their jet to fly for 15 minutes.
Yeah, well that's basically what Drake did. He flew from Toronto to the nearest city over. We have train service that go between these two cities. He could have easily just gone to Go Trends and been like, give me a private boxcar and taken the bus or taken the train or taken a private bus and it would have been fine. But no, he had to fly.
Yeah.
All right. So yeah, so this then assess. This will be unshocking to anybody. I think everyone kind of takes this. This is a who's at risk most from the effects of climate change. Canada is least at risk on this list, but then you get into the global south, and China, interesting, despite being is very at risk. I'm surprised Mongolia up here isn't more at risk. I figure because China's such a big economy that Mongolia would be at high risk, that China would be at high risk in Mongolia, but I guess not.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is the risk assessment. This should, by and large, this should surprise no one. There may be a couple specific things that I wouldn't have called. I wouldn't have expected Greenland to be so at risk, but I guess because they have so many glaciers. But yeah, this should surprise no one. This is who's most at risk, and it's exactly how we would more or less expect it.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything else we want to go over in this one? That was we went over the main thing that I wanted to go over with this. Box 1, inequality impact preparedness. This is how prepared. Yeah, let's read this thing on how prepared various countries are. The poorest people on the planet are not the least responsible for are not only the least responsible for causing climate change. They also tend to be the most vulnerable to its consequences and least prepared to cope. But such inequalities are horizontal as well as vertical, with women facing greater risk than men, rural communities often more exposed than urban ones, and groups marginalized because of race, ethnicity, and other factors likely to be disproportionately affected. This has huge relevance for this particular stream, as we are looking at this through an Indigenous lens, and you better believe Indigenous people are at some of the highest risks for the fallout of climate change.
Yep.
Mostly because most Indigenous people have already been displaced off of their traditional lands onto the least usable lands already.
Mm-hmm.
A recent study at World Bank found that 52 countries analyzed most people live in countries where poor people, defined by the poorest 20% of national population, are more exposed to disasters like droughts, floods, heat waves than the average population as a whole. and significantly so in many countries in Africa and Asia and East. Africa and South and East Asia. I sort of almost feel, given what we've seen what happened with Texas, that Texas deserves its own little like higher at risk. Such inequalities can be seen in rich countries to the poorest residents. The Gulf states, the U.S., Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, are exposed to disproportionate threat to coastal flooding as a result of rising sea levels. When Superstorm Sandy hit New York in 2012, 33% of individuals in the storm surge area lived in government-assisted housing, with half of 40,000 public housing residents in the city displaced. Not only are the richest countries and the richest communities with less than affected communities within them less affected by climate change, they also tend to be far better prepared to cope with it. In California, USA, irrigation coverage over 8% of arable land, while Niger, Burkina Faso, and Chad, Burkina Faso, I think that is, and Chad is less than 1%. While 91% of farmers in the U.S. have crop insurance cover to cover losses in the event of extreme weather, only 15% of farmers in India are covered. This has a lot to do with the farmer protests that were happening in India last year. 10% in China and just 1% in Malawi and most other low-income countries. So yeah, that also should surprise no one.
Right.
Estimated distribution of lifestyle consumption emissions. Let's read this box as well. A technical summary of methodology behind the estimates presented in this briefing is available on Oxfam. You'll just find that if you click the link. You can find that quote. The approach adopted by the approach adopted assumes that the elastic relationship between income emissions. Put simply, it takes data on income shares of different percentiles at a national level and distributes aggregate national emissions to those percentiles. It draws on two data sets: national income distribution data from analysis by Banko Milanovic, based on household surveys of 118 countries in a benchmark year of 2008, estimated total carbon emissions squared, emissions associated with household consumptions, which we here term lifestyle consumption emissions, from Glenn Peters, based on multi-regional input-output trade models covering 121 countries from the year 2007. Critical, the carbon emission squared model represents emissions from consumption rather than production. So this is in contrast to the other paper we just read. The other paper was about emissions by production. This is about emissions by consumption. The underlying trade model allocates emissions associated from goods and services to a territory in which consumption takes place rather than the country in which production occurred. This gives a more realistic picture of the actual emission citizens of different levels of incomes within a country. Emissions associated with consumption by government, capital, and international transport, and therefore exclude. The production of total consumption emissions attribute to lifestyle of consumption emissions of individuals in various countries by global. This isn't actually as interesting as I thought it was going to be. Lifestyle consumption emissions are highly unique within and between countries. So this is. I'm not going to bother reading this, but let's look at this graph here. So this graph here represents who pollutes the most by class per country. So top 1% in Canada pollutes a huge amount.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the average consumption is a little higher. So if we compare to Canada, so Canada's the next country so like the top 10% in the US is dwarfs the top 10% in Canada. But the bottom percent, well, a little higher, is pretty comparable between Canada and the US. And then like they get more and more comparable as you go down in class. I don't know what GBR means. I assume this is Germany, maybe. This is Dutch. To Italy, Russia, France, Japan, Korea. ZAF, I don't know what ZAF means. Mexico, Turkey, Argentina, China. So wow, look at China's consumption. Damn. So China may have been major in the production line, but they were not very big in the consumption line. Mind you, China is a much bigger player in consumption now than it was in 2015. So this might be different now, but that's still really interesting to see that in 2015 China was so low on consumption. I assume this is Brazil. This is India. I don't know what IDN means. But yeah, like, so it really is by and large America, and then followed by Canada. But like America's top 10% still has Canada beat by 50%. Anything else we want to see? So total lifestyle consumption emissions from G20 countries from which the data was available. Okay. So here we go. So we look at the total instead of Canada actually comes out pretty good, with China being much higher there. So that's interesting. I don't want to reread the whole page just because my voice is starting to get hoarse, and we've been streaming for an hour and a half almost. But I am curious what factors in that difference, why Canada is so high on per capita. Oh, right. So this is population size. No, this actually makes perfect sense. So Canada, when adjusted for population size, individual Canadians consume a lot. But because China has so much more population, they consume a lot more than Canada overall. Okay, this actually does make perfect sense. It took me a second to figure it out. Yeah, this is just like our investment in carbon emission is holding us back from broad equality. I think that's pretty much all we want to look at from this paper.
Mm-hmm.
I think going on to the next one from 2020 is maybe the way to go. Although I've not read the 2021, so I won't have as good of a grasp on the content. Like this one, I could make broad assumptions because I've read it before. Just get the new window open. Share screen. Share screen. Share screen. That should be the correct one. Is that the right one? That is the right one. Perfect. Sorry, I'm not more active in the chat. It's sort of hard for me to divide my attention between chat and reading the paper. So Fig 1 for the CO2 emissions associated to lifestyle consumption. Great Britain. All right, so on to the 2020 paper. So where do we want? Let's start with the summary, because that'll give me an idea of what we should want to go over and what we want to skip. Amidst the global health economy crisis, the climate crisis continues to grow. Extreme weather disasters have not stalled during the COVID-19 pandemic. From cyclone Amphan in India and Bangladesh to wildfires raging in the U.S., serving as a potent reminder that the world stands perilously close to exceeding its 1.5 goal of the Paris agreements. So that's one thing with the first paper we're looking at. They were talking about 2 goals. That was before. So this is the actual. So I was targeting 2 degrees Celsius. This one is the broadly accepted 1.5 degrees Celsius. New research by Oxfam and Stockholm Environmental Institute reveals the extreme carbon inequality in recent decades that have driven the world to climate brink from 1990 to 2015, a critical period in which annual emissions grew 60% and cumulative emissions doubled. We estimate that the richest 10% of the world population, 630 million people, were responsible for 52% of the cumulative carbon emissions, depleting the global carbon budget by nearly a third, 31%, in those 25 years alone. The poorest 50% were responsible for just 77% of cumulative emissions and used just 4% of available carbon budget. The richest 1%, 63 million people, alone were responsible for 15% of cumulative emissions and 9% of the carbon budget. Twice as much as the poorest world in the world's population. The richest 5% were responsible for over a third, 37%, of total carbon emissions, while total gross emissions of the richest 1% was 3 times out of the poorest 50. Restrictions related to the pandemic saw global emissions fall this year, but unless those emissions continue to decline rapidly, the 1.5 Celsius global carbon budget will be fully depleted by 2030. The inequality is such that the richest 10% alone would fully deplete it in just a few years later, even if everyone else emissions drop to zero tomorrow. Over 20 to 30 years, the climate crisis has been fueled and our limited global carbon budget squandered in the service of increasing the consumption of the already affluent rather than lifting people out of poverty. The 2 groups that suffered most from the injustice are those least responsible for climate crisis, poorest and marginal people already struggling with climate impact today. Future generations who will inherit a depleted carbon budget and a world accelerating towards climate breakdown. Governments must put tackling the twin climate and inequality crisis at the heart of COVID-19 recovery. A failure to, well, that didn't happen. So one thing with like having this thing be even just a couple of years ago, we already know how they handled the COVID recovery, and boy, did this not happen.
Yeah.
A failure to confront extreme carbon inequalities at the historic juncture, prioritizing yet more grossly unequal carbon intensive economic growth to the benefit of the rich minority, will mean jumping from the frying pan into of the current pandemic to the fire of an uncontrolled, irreversible climate crisis. Yet, while the pandemic triggers a chaotic and often inequitable contribution in consumptions around the world, it has also shown that once unthinkable changes to the lifestyles of the richest in society can be adopted in the interests of us all. Public policies from taxing luxury carbon SUVs, frequent business classes, flights, private jets, to expanding digital and public transport infrastructure, can cut emissions, reducing inequality and boosting public health. But to do so before the carbon budget for 1.5 degrees Celsius totally depleted, this must happen now. And yeah, so here's another visualization of who consumes what. So all of these people, this is actually, I actually like to see more than the other visualization. This is really useful.
Yeah.
So all of these people consume just this, whereas all of these people consume all of this. There's all these gray people consume all of that, and this one little black person, that's a bad. No, this one person indicated in black by black consumes all of this. Oxfam, I love you. Choose your colors better.
Like, I get what they're trying to go for there, but like, I don't know, maybe be a little bit more mindful about
it's
color
fine
choice.
until you have to describe it, and then you get into trouble. And this is the total carbon budget. So that's the total, and this is the carbon budget of the past of 1990 to 2015. So only 4%, 25%, and then like, boom, 22 and 9%. With this all remaining. So, yeah, we've already used up most of our carbon budget.
Mm-hmm.
That's not great.
Yeah, no.
Dinosaur graph of unequal carbon emissions growth. Okay. I'll zoom in a bit, actually. So total consumption emissions 1990, total consumption emissions 2015, share of total emission growth. So, okay. Poorest, the richest. So I'm actually not entirely. So I get why they call it dinosaur graph, because this looks like a brontosaurus. Oh, it just is a brontosaurus. That is just. Okay, so this is. So okay, I see how this is supposed to go now. So these light are. This is by class.
Mm-hmm.
So with the richest and the poorest, and this is the light green is the consumption. In 1990, and then the dark green is consumption in 2015. Okay. So yeah, so the rich have almost doubled their consumption since 1990, whereas the poor have basically remained largely equal. It's only when you get into like starting to get them into the upper echelons of the 50 poorest percent and then into the 40% where you start to see consumption change between the 90s. But even then, they're not really that substantial. I shouldn't say that's actually not true, because they get pretty substantial when you get into like right around here-ish. And maybe the higher ends, that's not that big a change, but it's only because they're already consuming so much.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so once again, it's just this throws into doubt so many of the established narratives of how we are actually supposed to address climate change.
Right.
Like, if the poor people are already consuming the same amount that if the poorest are already consuming the same amount that they were in 1990, whereas we're seeing like double is probably much, one third more on the richest end. Like, these people can't cut their emissions enough to make up for this.
Right.
Like, It's just impossible.
Mm-hmm.
So, once again, capitalism must be abolished. That is the only solution here. Because we can't depend on the top 5% to cut these emissions. Like when we have no mechanisms to make them.
Right.
So I guess that's the thing. Because of how capitalism is structured, we have no methods to force this top 10% to cut their emissions. They just have to do it out of the goodness of their heart. And
which, like, in the past, that has like not really happened all that often.
yeah, like exactly. Like I'm sure a couple of them will, but like they'll be a drop in the bucket
Mm-hmm.
without actual means to make them change their consumption habits.
Right.
I mean, obviously, the means to make them change their consumption habits is socialism, but they're not ready for that conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Do we want to read? So yeah, let's read this. Unequal economic growth slows poverty and poverty reduction rates. The World Bank recently concluded that continued unequal growth will barely make a dent in the number of people living on less than $1.90 per day by 2030. Only a reduction in income inequality will help. One estimate suggests it would take around 200 years at current rates to lift everyone above the $5.50 poverty line, which, by the way, will not be the poverty line anymore because of inflation.
Yep. Boy, I love this so much. The state
A
of
terribly
affairs we're in.
ineffective and morally indefensible approach to poverty reduction. Well, we are absolutely in agreement here, Oxfam. But unequal growth has another cost. It means that the global carbon budget is being rapidly depleted, not to the response of lifting all of the humanity to a decent living standard, but to a large extent to expand the consumption of a minority of the world's richest people. This is an injustice, which is felt most cruelly by two groups who have contributed the least to climate crisis: the world's poorest and most vulnerable people around the world, already experiencing the impact of a world that is 1 degree Celsius hotter, and future generations who will inherit a depleted carbon budget and even more dangerous climate. So this is we haven't talked about tackling this, and like I don't know what this will say because I haven't read this paper, but I think this is something worth reading. So I'm going to go read through this as well, and then we'll look at this graph here. Over the past 20 years, much of the population and political debate about climate change has focused on the impact of global middle class in countries like China and India. While this is important, our analysis suggests that close attention is also needed on the outsized impact of the world's richest, wherever they live, to encourage a more equitable use of remaining global carbon budget. To limit global heating to 1.5 C, global average per capita emissions should be approximately 2.1 T year by two. I don't know what T year stands for. I don't know what metric that is. Total year by 2030, based on our estimates as shown in Figure 3. The per capita consumption footprint of the richest 1% are currently around 35 times higher than the target for 2030, and more than 100 times higher than the poorest 50%. The per capita footprint of the richest 10% is more than 10 times, not 100, that of the 1.5 C consistent target for 2030, and more than 30 times higher than the poorest 50%. reducing the per capita footprint of the richest 10% to the 1.5 consistent level by 2030 would cut annual carbon emissions by over a third. And even reducing it to the level of the EU average would cut an annual emissions by over a quarter. Total per capita consumption, emissions, individual differences, global outcomes. So, okay, so this is just total consumption emissions. So 40% of the population consumes almost as much as 10%, with the 1% consuming a lot, and then the poorest 50% consuming barely anything. This is and these are the target per capita consumption emissions. I don't quite know how to read this graph because I don't know per capita consumption emissions target. So this is a target,
Right.
but I don't know what these black squares mean.
Per capita consumption emissions in 2015.
I'm just going to skip this one because I don't know how to read it, and where the other ones I was able to figure it out pretty quickly. I'm having a hard time grasping this one. All right, where to start? The richest 10% of the world's population live in every continent, and the geographic consumption of the group has evolved over the last 20 to 30 years, as indicated in Figure 4. That's this. That's figure. This is Figure 3. Figure 4 is down here. We'll look at that in a moment. Around half the emissions of the richest 10% are today associated with consumptions of the citizens of North America and the EU, and around a fifth, 9.2, of global emissions with citizens in China and India. Over a third of the emissions of the richest 1%, 5.7% global emissions, are today linked with citizens in the US, with the next biggest contribution coming from the Middle East and China. All right, so Figure 4. So this is 1990 richest. So with and this is divided by nations. Okay, this one's actually pretty easy to understand. Rest of the world. So North America, it's us. Consume less of a global total, but we still consume a lot. The European Union. Oh, European Union actually done a decent job cutting theirs. Look at that. Now, once again, this is by class. So richest 10%, which we don't follow to. We're closer down here. With China, China's middle class consumes quite a bit.
Yeah.
But like I said, I did predict when we were looking at the older one that China would have moved, because China was, because China went from being a relatively poor country to the world's second biggest economy pretty quickly. Like 40 years, they did that change.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, for the foremost consumption that makes up the very high footprint of these groups may very considerably depend on the national context in which they live, among other factors. For example, the emissions from driving will likely be higher in less dense populated countries. We need to get away from car dependency.
Yep.
We need to get away from car dependency.
Yep.
Nonetheless, some patterns in the consumption habits of high-income people can be identified based on national specific studies. For example, Figure 5 here shows consumption categories associated with households of top 10% and 1% of emitters in the European Union based on other recent analyses. So there you go. So look at how much air travel in EU's top emitters versus 1% versus 10%. This is what we're talking about with fucking Drake and other people and the Kardashians.
Yep.
taking frivolous flights. By far, the largest share of emissions among these high EU emitters is for transport, car journeys, essentially for the very highest emitters, flights. This pattern seems common across the regions. Other recent studies estimated that the top 10% richest households globally use around 45% of all energy linked to land transport and around 75% of energy linked to aviation, compared to just 10% and 5% respectively for the poorest 50%. Transport, which accounts for around a quarter of global carbon emissions today, most of which are from the road vehicles, rising fast in many countries, was found to be the most unequal consumption category, with income elasticity demanding much higher than one, i.e. income increase, blah, blah, blah. By contrast, home heating and electricity are found to be more inelastic, implying that they are more basic goods, which tend to be constituted by the majority of emission footprints of lower income groups. Yeah, basically people want to freeze to death. So that's a consistent consumption. Understanding these differences is critical to identifying policy measures and reducing consumption emissions footprints and inequality. Taxes or bans are more appropriate measures for curtailing luxury carbon consumptions. So this is where I was talking about, like, where you get like liberal answers that I don't necessarily agree with.
Right.
It's like taxes or bans are more appropriate measures for curtailing luxury carbon consumption of items like SUVs, high-end sports cars, and frequently business class private jets. Like, these might have been appropriate solutions in the 80s,
Right.
but we're past this being a viable option.
Mm-hmm.
Now we have to ban capitalism.
Right. Yeah.
Alternate public investments such as energy efficiency improvements and affordable housing is more appropriate to improve footprint associated with home heating, to avoid retrogressive impacts on lower income housing. And then we get into the COVID-19 impact. And then we're done. All right, let's read this COVID-19. My voice is getting kind of hoarse, but we're almost done. Although we do have, let's close that one. Not do that. We do have the third Oxfam paper, which predicts where things will go in 2030, which is in association with this. See if we want to read that. Let me finish this first. Government must put tackling twin crises of climate and inequality at the heart of recovery efforts for 2019. They have historic and final opportunities to start building fair economies within the limit of our panel. I remember in 2020 when we were hopeful this was going to happen. I remember being slightly optimistic.
What?
And I remember
What different
talking
times?
about
What? The optimism that has like shifted from that time.
Well, now we're all fucking like, it's hard. It's hard to talk about how, like, in 2020 we were optimistic compared to where we are now.
Yeah, like, good lord.
Anyways, the pandemic triggers an unplanned and often inequitable contraction consumptions around the world, but it has also shown that governments can act radically. They can. They just won't.
Right, yeah.
In the face of an imminent threat. And that, I mean, I'll give, once again, I don't want to stand for China. I don't particularly care for China, but their response has been so much better than everyone else's.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I mean, my critique for China has nothing to do with them as, like, I have nothing against Chinese people. I just don't like centralized authority structures.
Yeah.
That's the anarchist versus the, like, ML perspective. We've had that conversation before, although I don't archive these, so those conversations are not archived. I might start archiving them with this one. Like I might try and find a way to put this onto YouTube because
Right.
I think this is valuable. Although also, like, I've been talking for 2 hours straight. My voice is hoarse, and I don't want to lose that sacrifice.
Yeah. Right.
So yeah, the right public policy measures enacted now can both cut emissions and richest before 1.5 global carbon budget is completely depleted. Create a healthy more. Yeah, I don't really think we need to bother reading this. This looks like it's more just an overview of things we've already talked about. Oh, okay, no, maybe let's continue reading because I think some of these bullet points are interesting. Cohesive and resilient societies, in addition to essential measures to rapid shifting energy supply, sustainable renewable sources, government should consider wealth tax, carbon tax. Yeah, good luck. We've been trying to get that one since the 90s.
Right. Yeah.
Like I said, this is another one where, like, had this been implemented in the 80s or 90s when they were first being proposed, I might have done something, but it's too late now. I mean, I guess too late is a matter of like perspective. Like, it'll still help us not hit that 4 degrees Celsius, so it might be worth doing, but it doesn't solve the larger problem. Such as carbon sales tax on SUVs, private jets, personal yachts, yada yada yada. This is a very liberal stuff. This is stuff I was talking about at the start. Ending tax-free statutes for aircraft fuel, unconditional aviation industry ballot and tax breaks for company cars. Yeah, I can get, like, once again, this is all like bare minimum stuff, but yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Like, none of this deals with the larger problem of like capital and the incentive system of the way capitalism incentivizes wealth wealth hoarding.
Mhm.
But you know, it would be a good start.
Right.
Public investment, including creating decent job guarantees. Yes. This alongside working time reductions where appropriate. Yes. We should not be working 40 hours a week.
Right. Yeah.
Cutting our 40-hour work week to a 32-hour would absolutely reduce carbon emissions. And it would basically make your citizenry happier because they'd have more free time.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's a solution, but it's something we should absolutely be doing.
Right.
Building infrastructure for electric mobile public transport, cycling, walking, and digital community. This is the one that I'm big on these days. This is like this is the one that I really hammer on, which is like public infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
Getting away from like inefficient building models, putting in more missing middle, designing this. Although Toronto did just like this week finally put in that we're like allowed to have like local companies that serve the community again, so you don't need to drive out to get your groceries. That'll improve things. So big up on Toronto for that. Only took you way too long. Improving energy efficiency in housing, especially to reduce energy bills of low income marginalized groups. Yeah. Expanding low carbon sectors like health and social care, which are overwhelmingly benefited by women. Yeah. So yeah, we should just be like, I don't know how things are where you are right now, but like our healthcare system is about to crash because of COVID taxation, because our government refuses to do anything about COVID now.
Mm-hmm.
And like reinvesting into healthcare would be good for the economy and just good for everyone involved.
Yeah.
Banning advertising in public spaces, requiring more. This one's interesting.
Ooh.
Requiring more circular business models and a right to repair manufacturing goods. I am super pro right to repair.
Mm-hmm.
I'm interested about this banning advertising in public spaces. That's really interesting. I don't know how that would help carbon emissions, but I'm definitely just here for it as a concept.
Right. Yeah.
Get rid of those fucking billboards.
Mm-hmm.
Changing corporate governments to circular companies, short-termism, and creating accountability for long-term social and environmental impacts. Setting science and equality and equity-based national targets to reduce carbon emissions from consumption as well as production, and developing a wider set gender transformative indicators of economic progress beyond GDP, such as New Zealand's well-being budget. I mean, New Zealand. I don't want to big up New Zealand too much because they're still a fucking settler state, but New Zealand's doing some interesting stuff.
Right. Yeah.
I was recently on Conquest of Dreads, who's Maori's podcast, and we talked a little bit about some of the stuff New Zealand was doing. Critical and incorporate principles of social dialogue at all levels to ensure that the voice of workers, effective businesses. So this is just more democratization of the workplace. This is the big thing. This is another big thing I advocate, which is that like workplaces should be democratized. That's, I mean, workplace democracy is like socialism 101. It's sort of the one thing that, like, no matter what school of socialism you belong to, you should be advocating for workplace democracy, unless you're a fucking patsock, because patsocks aren't actually socialists.
Right.
we gotta like that one fucking dude who I don't want to bother looking up his name because I don't want to give him any like shout outs, who's talking about like how like Starbucks workers don't deserve a union. Like, motherfucker, what?
God.
Yeah, and this is basically the same. Just to reiterate the same graph we've already seen of like how much we've used, total versus cumulative emissions. So, who uses what? So yeah, so depending if you use total or cumulative, like the middle have actually even used even less. They haven't even used 50%.
Mm-hmm.
So, and only 25% of the current budget. So, yeah, and that's the end of that paper. Now, there is one more we can theoretically go to, but it's been 2 hours.
Yeah.
I
need to eat something that isn't popcorn.
Yeah, I've only had some pizza today. What I'll do is I'm just going to drop the link for it. It's also Oxfam. It's a hypothetical carbon inequality in 2030, if like where things will go if we keep on the current path in 2030.
Mm-hmm.
I also have not read it, so I don't know any of the content in it. It's much shorter than the other ones, but still, I'm starting to get hoarse. I need something to drink. Paste that. Give me a second to go through. The comments here. I've not been interacting with the comments, but I want to at least get a second to read through these and address any points that still need to be talked about. Even without the highest percent, there would still be a problem with, yes, absolutely. Especially since the poor countries legitimately want life quality. So it's interesting with the poor qualities wanting life quality, because they might be able to skip the carbon growth process and go right to renewables, sort of. But they need Western support to do that.
Mm-hmm.
But like that is one thing with carbon inequality is we want these poor countries to not rely on fossil fuels, which is dope. Like, but we need to support them in developing methods that aren't carbon intensive to maintain a high quality of life. And right now, we're not doing that, especially not Canada, because Canada is an oil producing country. So Canada wants. Also, Canada makes a lot of arms. So Canada stands to benefit from like a global destabilized globe, because we sell a lot of arms to the rest of the world, and we also sell a lot of oil. So we have a super. We're reputed as being helpful. So, but like if it comes to our reputation versus like our bottom line, Canada's going to go for the bottom line every time.
Mm-hmm.
But like these countries that want to have a high quality of living, because they don't have to go through the carbon process that North America went through, or that Europe and the developed world went through.
Right. Yeah.
They can go right to renewables if they want. They need our support to do it, and because of the nature of capital, I'm not sure they're going to get that support, and it's really frustrating.
Mm-hmm.
Would you rather have all the basic needs met, or have? Oh, I saw that meme. Like yesterday. I'm gonna throw this up. So this was the dude like sweating pushing the button meme.
Oh yeah.
That was this, and then like it ends with the dude pushing the 1% meme. About banning ads, they probably think about these big electric. Oh, that's fair. Yeah, that's fair because I'm thinking billboards, but you're right. Like people don't advertise on billboards anymore. People advertise on like big fucking Times Square, like giant TVs.
Yeah,
Consume
like
a
there's
lot of
even
electricity.
one here in like where I'm at, and it's wild. Like there's
Yeah.
there's like a few in town here. Like,
Well, yeah. So it's like in my immediate area, it's all billboards. But yeah, if I go down to Young Dundas Square, it's all of those big screens.
yeah, and I know there's like, I know like on like bus stops and stuff too, they have like other electrical panels and like stuff. So,
Yeah. So Trey also just said that I'm gonna. I don't want to use your incorrect pronouns. I'm gonna use he. Sorry, Treo. I'm gonna use he him, but if that's not the correct pronoun, please correct me. But yeah, like there's a larger conversation to be had about like whether renewables can actually solve the energy crisis.
right.
I'm perhaps a little more optimistic than you are, Treo, but I definitely think it's a very legitimate concern. If we hadn't been going for 2 hours, there was also a paper. Like I'm very skeptical of nuclear as well.
Yeah, same.
This puts me in the shit camp with a lot of like environmentalists who are very pro nuclear. I'm not pro nuclear. I'm not anti-nuclear for the storage, which tends to be the thing that most people are anti-nuclear for. I'm more concerned about nuclear for the extraction portion.
Yep.
But that's if we had more time. I had a paper on that I could have gone over too. But I just, like I said, I've been reading for 2 hours, so I don't have another paper in me. But I think we'll probably do a more conventional next time. So we do this every 2 weeks, and then on alternating weeks I do a Star Trek one, which is more just frivolous and fun. But we'll probably do another one where we go through some papers again at some point in the future. But I think for our next one we'll probably just pick a topic and shoot the shit.
Yeah.
Where that's more of a that's more like Otoya is also more involved in that. It's less just me reading off shit. But please come back if you enjoyed this. Also we get more into like when it's not just me reading it, we get into more of an Indigenous perspective as well.
Mm-hmm.
This was just me reading papers. But yeah, anyways, I would like to gather some more environmental papers and do this again sometime, but it might be a bit because this is really hard on my voice.
Yeah.
Anyways, yeah. Yeah, I think we're going to call it there. 2 hours is a good place.
Yeah.
I think we'll, I posted the link for the third Oxfam paper if you want to read it. We might go over it another time. Like, I might assemble another, like I said, in like a month or two, we might do this again, where I just assemble a bunch of papers and we read it, or I might do it on my own time without Soya being here. If I'm free.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for coming. Otoya, thanks for listening to me read this. You didn't have that much to contribute today, but you got to be nice and relaxed because of that.
Yeah.
All right. Anyways, cheers. I'm going to end the broadcast now. Once again, thank you all for coming.
Doksha.